The house that devours. The house on Blackwood Lane had been abandoned for decades. No one in town dared to step inside, not after the stories, whispers of disappearances, eerie lights flickering in the windows, and the strange sensation that the house itself was alive. But Daniel Grayson didn't believe in ghost stories. As a professional urban explorer, he had built a career documenting supposedly haunted locations, debunking myths with logic and reason. When he heard about Blackwood House, he knew he had to see it for himself. Armed with a flashlight and his camera, Daniel pushed open the rotting wooden doors. They groaned under his touch, as if the house itself was protesting his presence. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of mildew and decay. Dust coated every surface, and cobwebs clung to the grand chandelier that hung precariously from the ceiling. The house was silent, too silent. He clicked on his camera and started recording. "This is Blackwood House," he murmured. "No one's lived here in over 50 years. But tonight, we're going to find out why." His voice echoed eerily through the empty halls. As he moved deeper into the house, the wooden floor beneath him creaked with each step. The walls seemed to close in around him, and the air grew colder, as if the house were breathing. He reached the grand staircase, its railing covered in dust. As he ascended, a sound, so faint he barely registered it, came from above. A whisper. He turned sharply. "Hello?" Silence. He shook his head. Just his imagination. Reaching the second floor, he found himself in a long hallway lined with doors, each one slightly ajar. A draft swept through, carrying with it the scent of something rotten. He approached the first room, pushing the door open wider. Inside was a child's bedroom, untouched by time. A rocking chair sat in the corner, facing the window, and on the bed lay a single porcelain doll with lifeless, glassy eyes. He stepped inside, scanning the room. Then, creak. The rocking chair moved. Daniel froze. The chair rocked slowly, as if something, had just stood up from it. A cold sweat broke across his skin. He turned to leave, but as he reached the doorway, the whisper returned. This time, it was right behind him. "You shouldn't be here." Daniel spun around, his flashlight flickering. The room was empty. His breath came in shallow gasps. It had to be the wind. Just the wind. He hurried out, closing the door behind him. Daniel continued down the hall, determined to finish his exploration. At the end of the corridor was a door unlike the others, larger, heavier, its wood darkened with age. A strange symbol was carved into it, worn by time but still recognizable. It looked hungry. He placed his hand on the doorknob. The house groaned. Daniel's breath hitched. It sounded almost pained. He hesitated, then turned the knob. The door swung open, revealing a spiral staircase descending into darkness. A chill ran through him, but he pressed on, step by step, deeper into the unknown. The deeper he went, the more the air changed. It became thick, damp, suffocating. The walls weren't made of stone or wood, but something else, something that pulsed. Daniel's flashlight flickered again. Then, it went out. Total darkness. A sound rose around him, a deep, guttural breathing. The house was alive. A single, wet footstep echoed from the bottom of the stairs. Daniel's pulse thundered in his ears. He fumbled with his flashlight, hands shaking. Another step. Closer. Then another. Then silence. His fingers found the flashlight switch. He clicked it on. The beam illuminated the bottom of the staircase, revealing the horror that waited for him. A figure, gaunt, stretched, with hollow black pits where eyes should be. Its mouth hung open, impossibly wide, dripping with something thick and dark. It smiled. Daniel stumbled backward, his body screaming at him to run. But the stairs were gone. The passage behind him had vanished, replaced by a solid wall of pulsating, fleshy material. He was trapped. The figure took a step forward, its elongated fingers twitching. Daniel raised his camera, desperate to capture something, anything. The figure tilted its head. Then, in a voice that wasn't a voice at all, it whispered, "Welcome home." Daniel's screams never made it out of the house. Outside, Blackwood House stood still and silent, as it always had. The town remained unaware of the latest victim claimed by the house. And in one of the upstairs windows, Daniel's camera now sat, still recording, its lens aimed at the front door, waiting for the next visitor. The end. The House That Watches. The house at the end of Hollow Creek Road had been abandoned for nearly a century. The townspeople spoke of it only in hushed tones, their voices filled with unease. It was known simply as the Holloway House, and it was more than just haunted. It was cursed. Children who played too close to its rusted iron gate reported hearing whispers in the wind. Those who dared step onto the property felt an unnatural chill creeping into their bones. And the few who had entered its decaying halls were never seen again. But Adam Collins wasn't afraid. A well-known urban explorer, Adam had spent years debunking ghost stories and investigating so-called haunted locations. His YouTube channel, Ghosts Exposed, had amassed millions of followers. He had explored abandoned asylums, forgotten churches, and old prisons, but nothing had ever truly scared him. Holloway House was supposed to be his next big challenge. As he stood in front of the towering structure, the evening sky cast the house in an eerie glow. Its wooden walls were warped and cracked, its windows like hollow eyes staring down at him. The door stood slightly ajar, as if waiting for him to step inside. Adam pulled out his camera, hit record, and took a deep breath. "All right, guys," he whispered. "We finally made it. Holloway House, one of the most haunted places in America. They say it's alive, that it watches anyone who enters. Let's find out if the stories are true." He stepped inside. The air was wrong. It was thick, heavy, pressing down on him like an invisible weight. The floor creaked beneath his boots, the sound echoing through the massive foyer. Dust floated in the dim light, swirling in strange patterns. Faded wallpaper peeled away in long, curling strips, and a massive chandelier hung precariously above him, its crystals coated in grime. Adam took another step. Then he heard it. A whisper. Faint. Too soft to make out the words, but undeniably there. His breath hitched. His grip tightened on the camera. "Hello," he called, his voice barely above a whisper. Silence. Then, a soft giggle. A child's giggle. Adam turned sharply. His flashlight darted across the room, illuminating an old staircase. The railing was broken in places, and the steps sagged under years of neglect. At the top stood a figure. Small. Still. Watching. His heart pounded. He squinted, trying to see through the dimness. It was a girl, or at least, it looked like one. She wore a tattered white dress, her dark hair hanging in limp strands around her pale face. Her eyes were wide, too wide, her lips barely parted. She didn't move. Adam swallowed hard. "Hey, are you okay?" The girl blinked. Then, in a voice that didn't belong to a child, she whispered, "You shouldn't be here." A cold shiver ran through him. Then she was gone. One blink, and the stairs were empty. Adam exhaled, trying to steady his nerves. It had to be a trick of the light. A hallucination brought on by the unsettling atmosphere. He continued forward, moving toward the main hallway. The deeper he went, the more wrong everything felt. The walls seemed closer, the air colder. The house smelled of rot, as if something long dead was buried within it. Then, a noise from upstairs. A slow, deliberate footstep. Adam's breath hitched. Another step. Then another. Something was moving. Something big. He aimed his flashlight toward the staircase. The beam wavered, his hands trembling slightly. At the top, where the girl had stood, a shadow loomed. Massive. Unmoving. watching. The light barely touched it. The darkness clung to it like a second skin, shifting and twisting unnaturally. Adam's gut screamed at him to run. But he didn't. He had never backed down before. Lifting his camera, he whispered, "Is someone there?" The shadow didn't respond. Instead, it moved. Not forward. Not toward him. Around him. The walls creaked. The air grew thick, suffocating. And then, the whispers returned. But this time, they weren't faint. They were everywhere. A chorus of voices, overlapping, hissing, sobbing, giggling, murmuring things he couldn't understand. His flashlight flickered. Then, everything went black. When Adam woke, he was lying on the floor. His head pounded. His body ached. His camera was gone. The house was silent. Slowly, he sat up, blinking in the dimness. Something was different. The air was heavier. The shadows darker. The house no longer felt like an abandoned ruin. It felt alive. Then he noticed the door. It was no longer open. It was sealed shut, the wood twisted and gnarled, like it had never been a door at all. A deep, creaking breath filled the air. Adam's pulse pounded in his ears. He turned slowly and saw the walls. They were moving. Bulging, shifting, pulsing like living flesh. Faces pushed through the wallpaper, distorted, screaming, trapped. Adam scrambled back, his breath coming in ragged gasps. Then, from the darkness, the girl's whisper returned. "It's watching you." The wall split open, revealing a gaping, tooth-lined maw. Adam screamed. The house swallowed him whole. The next morning, Holloway House stood as silent as ever. No sign of forced entry. No broken windows. Just a single camera, lying in the dust. Its screen flickered, still recording. Waiting. Watching. The end. The house that shouldn't exist. No one knew who built the house on Blackwood Lane. It wasn't on any official records. It didn't show up on maps. The neighbors swore it had never been there before. Yet, one morning, it was. A massive, crumbling Victorian mansion, looming at the end of the dead-end road. Its windows were dark voids, its wooden exterior rotted and splintered. The iron gate that surrounded it was rusted shut, and the front door, though old, looked strangely new. People whispered about it, but no one dared go near. No one except James Porter. James had always been drawn to mysteries, and this house was the biggest one he'd ever encountered. As a freelance investigator for strange occurrences, he had debunked ghost stories, explored forgotten tunnels, and even spent a night in an allegedly cursed forest. But something about this house felt different. It wasn't just haunted. It wasn't just cursed. It felt wrong. James didn't care. He had to know the truth. Armed with his flashlight, a camera, and a crowbar, he forced his way through the rusted gate and stepped toward the house. The air grew thick around him, pressing against his skin like invisible hands. The house seemed bigger the closer he got, its roof stretching endlessly into the sky. He reached the front door. It swung open before he could touch it. James hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to run. But he stepped inside. The first thing he noticed was the silence. Not the normal kind, but the kind that swallowed sound entirely. His own breathing felt muffled. His footsteps barely made a noise against the dusty wooden floor. His flashlight beam cut through the darkness, revealing a vast, decayed foyer. Cobwebs clung to the chandelier above, and a massive staircase led to a second floor shrouded in shadow. Something felt off. The architecture didn't make sense. Doors lined the walls at impossible angles. The windows were too high, the ceiling too far away. The house was larger on the inside than it had seemed outside. James took out his camera and started filming. "Haven't seen anything like this before," he murmured. "It's as if the house doesn't obey the rules of reality." He moved forward. The hallway stretched ahead of him, longer than it should have been. He turned a corner. The corridor twisted in ways that defied logic, doubling back on itself. Then he noticed something chilling. The door he had entered from was gone. His pulse quickened. He turned back, retracing his steps. But the house had changed. The walls had shifted. The staircase was on the wrong side. The furniture was different. It was as if the house was rearranging itself. James forced himself to stay calm. He had studied mazes before. He could find his way out. Then he heard a whisper. Soft. Indistinct. He turned, scanning the darkness. Nothing. Then a shadow moved. Something darted across the hall. James raised his flashlight. The beam landed on a figure. A man. Standing at the far end of the corridor. His back was turned. His clothes were old-fashioned, tattered. His head was tilted slightly, as if listening. James hesitated. "Hello," he called out. The man didn't move. James swallowed hard. "Do you live here?" Silence. Then, in a slow, jerking motion, the man twisted his head backward, but only his head. His body remained facing away, while his face turned toward James. His mouth opened too wide, stretching far beyond human limits. His eyes were black pits, empty and endless. James felt something move behind him. A cold breath touched his neck. He spun around. And the hallway was gone. James was no longer in the house. He was somewhere else. The walls around him pulsed like living flesh. The ceiling stretched upward forever, disappearing into darkness. Whispers slithered through the air, coming from inside the walls. The floor was soft. Wet. It squelched beneath his boots. A heartbeat echoed through the space. The house was alive. Panic set in. He ran. Corridors shifted, twisting in impossible ways. Doors led to nowhere. Some opened to vast, endless voids. Others revealed rooms that were wrong, upside down, filled with floating furniture, or occupied by shadowy figures that didn't move, didn't blink. Then, footsteps behind him. Slow. Deliberate. James didn't look back. He reached a door and threw it open. He stumbled inside, into a room full of mirrors. Except, they weren't mirrors. They were windows. And behind each one was himself. But they weren't reflections. They were versions of him, trapped, screaming, pounding against the glass. His own face stared back, eyes wide with horror, mouth silently begging for help. He turned to leave. And froze. The man with the twisted head was right behind him. Only now, his face was James's face. Grinning. The lights flickered. The whispers screamed. The world collapsed into darkness. The next morning, the house on Blackwood Lane was gone. No sign of it ever having existed. No foundation. No debris. Just an empty lot, as if nothing had ever been there. The only thing left behind was James's camera. Still recording. Still waiting. The end.